Thank you.
You're being joined on a panel by Xiaowei, Joel, Fredrik, and Nadisha, all of whom presented. Nadisha presented yesterday. Now, these presentations have had such a rich set of insights that they've really challenged my jet lag, but allow me to very quickly try to sort of encapsulate the points that are relevant to our discussion. Gopal, you started by highlighting that the full range of AI safety challenges that we're looking at within this landscape do manifest across a range of life science areas, and actually progress is happening in the life sciences in these different areas that provide insights and potential solutions for all of these. And you very effectively showed how your research links to both our landscape and to work in other domains like the AISafety Grid World's work that the DeepMind group are doing. Xiaowei highlighted that a number of incredibly important points, including that we need to increase our focus from primarily focusing on robustness to an increased focus on issues like generalization, I should say, verification and validation. When it comes to neural networks, we need techniques that allow for greater abstraction and that allow us to scale to the huge size of neural networks used in industry. And that there's a lot of preliminary research already happening here that represents really exciting progress, but lots and lots of opportunities for the engineering community to push forward on these challenges. And finally, Joel covered the point that there's a lot of exciting research happening at the moment in AI going meta and different types of meta learning and architecture search. And this is very exciting, but it introduces a new tension, a tension between control and creativity, which in some ways reflects some of the tensions we're seeing in other areas of AI safety, where we're having to choose between systems that we know exactly how they're going to behave and can verify them well ahead of time, versus systems that maybe learn on the fly when they're in the world. It's not quite the same challenge, but some of the same sorts of issues kind of come up. And he asked the question, how do we think about this, and how do we incentivize more responsible AI research? And how do we start thinking about the unknown unknowns, the challenges that are going to be coming up as we develop ever more powerful AI systems, and as the transition between research in the lab environment and systems that are out in the world really making the world a better place and affecting our industries and businesses, as that transition happens ever more quickly. So I thought we might start with the question of advances that are happening in AI research that really challenge the frameworks that we're already working with in AI safety, whether that's verification, validation, certification, or other. And I'll throw it open to the panel. Based on your own talks or what you've heard from others, where do you think that we really need to be focusing at the moment, or where can we learn from other areas that are involved in this?
One interesting place to start there would be to think of the coevolution between, for example, talking about verifiability and actual ML, and ML research into capabilities, would be that it's not always intuitive to people outside of verifiability what sorts of architectures and neural network structures will be more verifiable. So I have a colleague who works in this at AI Labs and was mentioning that some counterintuitive things sort of hold, where you might need like a very sparse network and it'd be easier to verify, or particular ways you might layer a network could be more or less easier to verify. And so maybe there's some interesting room for collaboration there, where you could, having those two communities talk more closely could guide ML research in such a way that you might not have to give up as much capability. There's some trade-off between how capable the system is and what structures are easier to verify that makes any sense. So maybe there's some interesting collaborative efforts that, because communities tend not to talk to each other as much, remain unfulfilled.
Okay, so my background is building complex and autonomous aircraft systems, unmanned aircraft systems. So we actually had fully autonomous UAVs around 15 years ago, 2004 or something like that. And one thing we've learned there is that in order to build these really complex systems, it's really hard to actually model them in order to be able to verify them in advance. So that's why we've been working a lot with this more runtime verification type of techniques. So I think that's one of just general, questions. I mean, how much can you verify in advance, or what do you verify in advance? So for example, in our case, we're using the same kind of formalisms that you can express your safety constraints and so on in, but instead of verifying the model of the system, you verify that the running system will not violate them, and you will be able to detect if it's going to violate them, and then you can react and respond to it. So this is one way of kind of shifting from what you do in advance and what you do at runtime. I think that's one interesting, and another interesting aspect is that when you build this kind of integrated systems, it's really hard also to kind of verify and to make sure that the kind of interactions between the different components of this integrated systems are in sync. So in some sense, I think there is a need for kind of a science of integration. How do you build integrated systems? How do you kind of get this kind of composability when it comes to, for example, verification and validation? So, two thoughts, please.
Well, I think it's also, what could also be interesting is to think where are the boundaries of a system? Because I think this changes the more capable the systems are. And then one gets all type of ethical entanglements. And as said in the talk yesterday, it is important to think about the objectives or utility functions or all equivalents, loss functions. What do we want? What is reflected in it? Do we have effective and dyadic considerations in the sense that sometimes it might not be obvious that they are inherently in it, but one has to see the larger context, so to speak, to identify problems that arise in addition. One also needs an adversarial approach to the own system and think about worst case scenarios, what type of attacks can be launched. And this also leads to trying to identify the knowledge that is missing. And it's important to consider that all these systems are operating within the human affective niche. So often the knowledge that is missing is actually something that reflects what we can do and the AI not. So we need all type of disciplines like neuroscience or psychology to find out the missing parts, for instance.
So as far as I see that right now all the verification and validation techniques, it's the efforts of trying to extend the previous success on the, for example, the software or hardware, and try to using similar techniques and apply to this new toy, basically. But I think that the point is that the toy is different with the previous toy, and then the thing is that when we try to do this, the problem is that you probably need to develop a new approach instead of just trying to adapt the previous approach. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the whole deep learning area, they do develop a lot of knowledges and all these kind of small areas. They try to study also how the neural network is working. I think that it's more of interdisciplinary, not interdisciplinary, but more of the areas they have to talk to each other and try to understanding each other how the knowledge of the deep learning can be actually used, try to improve the verification, and also the other way around. How to actually try to use the verification, these things to make the deep learning actually more solid. That's
Gopal, do you have a comment on this?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I'd like to speak a bit. Hold on, there's some feedback happening. I'd like to talk a bit about maybe the cultural angle on integration. People have talked a bit about this side. So this challenge of integrated culture is something we have a lot of experience with in the life sciences. As an example, so I presented briefly this result on autoencoders, and the only reason this happened is for 15 years at the Broad, we've hired very, very strong mathematicians to work on problems related to genomics and other areas of biology. There was no specific attempt to hire people with background in algebraic topology or manifold theory or anything like that. But there was a robust culture and enough people that when the opportunity arose, they were able to move quickly and prove a pretty interesting result in machine learning. And I think that type of strategy can be quite successful. It can't be random. It needs to be done thoughtfully. But something I'm actually working on right now that's, I think, maybe of interest to some of the panelists here is I'm working on organizing a workshop on formal methods, actually. Hopefully will be held next year at the Broad. And we're trying to take a similar mentality of saying, look, in the life sciences, we're building these incredibly powerful software systems. They range from systems that aren't necessarily used in real time, like, for example, I mentioned HAIL for genomic analysis, but extending all the way to clinical decision support systems and medical devices in a hospital setting, which very much are safety critical. It's clear to me that there's going to be many areas where we care about formal methods, although I don't want to prematurely optimize and say, hey, we need to formally verify this piece of software or even this component of this piece of software. So one of the things we're thinking about is taking a very loose approach to trying to bring together the communities of people involved in verification and validation and quantitative researchers as well as engineers in the life sciences. And I think that type of approach can be very fruitful in trying to bridge communities where it can be too premature to try to define precise technical roadmaps. But if we facilitate the conversation, we have a lot of confidence and a good track record for thinking that those roadmaps will emerge organically.
Thank you. I think one more question from me for now, and then I will throw it open to the audience because I imagine there are a lot of questions waiting. So one thing that's come across in all of the answers that we've heard is that in order to really kind of facilitate a paradigm shift in how we think about AI safety, we need greater integration across disciplines, that there are bodies of knowledge, insights and approaches in different fields that we can apply to the challenge of AI safety. I'd be interested in the panelists' view on what are the major obstacles or challenges to integrating these insights across disciplines. Is it a lack of convergence on what we mean when we think about AI safety? Is it terminological and jargon differences in how we speak about things? Is it an absence of venues in which we can really bring people together? So I might start by putting this question to Gopal about how we can better integrate insights in these areas between the life sciences and AI safety. Why is it not happening more already, and what can we do more of? But then I'd be very interested in the panelists' view on, for example, how we can better integrate the insights from computer science, from different aspects of AI research, from the engineering community and the AI research community in order to achieve this paradigm change that we need in order to be up to date with the advances happening in AI.
Sure. I think that's a great question, Sean. So in my perspective from the life sciences, I think a starting point is to really engage researchers in the life sciences on the idea that we have to go beyond trying to apply AI technologies and really take ownership of producing those technologies. And I think doing that really makes it more natural to tackle AI safety in a robust way. If we kind of following the kind of hype cycles of AI in, say, the startup and investment space, I think most people in biology or medicine think about AI technologies as something we're going to import. There's this AI world out there, and they build all these tools, and then we're going to apply them, and maybe that's going to improve our ability to, diagnose, EKGs or CT scans or whatever. And the reality is that kind of thinking hasn't panned out all that well, the reality being that the problems are different enough oftentimes in the life sciences. Sometimes it's in the details, sometimes it's for much larger in scope, that we have to do things from scratch. And the kind of ways of thinking that have, say, been very successful in advertising technologies haven't really panned out so well. And that itself is a deep question. One thing that we've been working on here is this seminar series called Models, Inference, and Algorithms. There's over 100 talks that you can see online. I put the link up there. And I think selling the idea of a deeper and a richer connection between AI and the life sciences gives us a really strong kind of platform with which to take on the next set of problems related to AI safety. And as I mentioned in my talk, the life sciences have a very rich tradition in thinking about safety to begin with. So I think that gives us a lot to work with.
One other perspective is, for instance, that one could think about, okay, we want to achieve value alignment, so we want to have a type of robustness against ethical adverse examples, so it's about ethics. So now how to get robustness here for ethical purposes. And then from this you get a type of a list of questions, for instance, which you can then try to invite people from working in different disciplines to help to integrate knowledge in a very goal-oriented way. And it's also important to, I think maybe a taxonomy could also help, that everyone could realize what type of system we're actually addressing. Are we talking about systems that can be governed by utility functions, or are we talking about systems that are already on their own, so to speak? They're already explanatory knowledge creators, so to speak, very akin to, so similar to people. And then this also changes then the ethical perspective that we have on that. So maybe a transdisciplinary taxonomy could help, such that we can use a common vocabulary.
I mean, so in general, I would say that all the things that you mention are, of course, obstacles, because, and I think in some sense the underlying challenge is time. Because, I mean, in order to actually get collaboration to start working, you have to get this kind of joint vocabulary, you have to understand how the different cultures of different disciplines work, and I mean, it takes time, you have to work together. And then, of course, you have issues with reviewing. You submit a paper to one community, and then they look at the kind of other disciplines, part of the paper, and say, oh, we don't understand it, or the content for this particular community is not strong enough, so it's a lot of those issues. But I really like this, that you have to be specific and concrete and work on some particular problem so that you can become detailed and specific enough to actually start working together, trying to solve the problem using the techniques from your different disciplines together. So I think that's a good way, and then you can build from that. But I think if you want to do that, it should be a long-term effort, because it will be a lot of investment before you will start reaping the benefits.
Yeah, I think I just echo a lot of what other people said here. It seems like at heart it could be a problem. Like the problem of collaboration in a transdisciplinary way is psychological in some ways. It's frustrating to try to bridge the divide. If you had this conversation where you're coming from one field and someone's coming from another field, just trying to actually understand what they're saying, or to communicate with them what you're saying in a way that they'll understand is frustrating. And so I think it's oftentimes people just bounce off of each other. And also just that there's a siloing that goes on in academia, institutions, and our incentives to publish in disciplinary journals. It just makes it really difficult to have a very broad-minded kind of view, and it's just really hard to manage. So I don't really know exactly the solution, but I do imagine it's long-term, as you said. It seems like a really hard issue to overcome.
So I agree that basically the first obstacle, as we all discussed, is that more of the discussion between areas. And as far as my experience is that even if we have done 2 or 3 years work, and it's quite difficult that for machine learning people to actually understand what we are doing. So we have spent like 2 or 3 years effort, and now gradually they start understanding what you are doing and how your approach is useful. And that's quite a lot of efforts. And let's actually justify why this kind of landscape effort is actually useful, because it's more like that we have now tried to push more of a common language and all the terminologies that we try to do, and these kinds of efforts. But as far as we see, it's more like we are less machine learning people around here, so we probably need to get more machine learning people around. That's one thing. And the second thing I'm thinking, the obstacle is more of, in addition to the terminology things, that we do need to have a small pool of problems, more concrete problems, as I recognize that they are talking about, is that we need to have some sort of problems and learn for different disciplines. We probably put up different approach, try to handle this same problem. And then we got more of a mutual understanding about what the capability of what you can do, and how the approaches can actually be combined, that kind of stuff. So it all needs to have something be more concrete, something, for example, at least for example, a benchmark, that kind of stuff. Still, I think it's still useful.
Thank you. Oh,
just wanted to add a short comment. I also think I agree, and also think that we all need to step out of our comfort zone, and simply we all need to integrate this knowledge into our brains, because otherwise we're going to talk in different languages and not going to understand each other.
On talking different languages and stepping out of our comfort zone, would anyone like to step out of their comfort zone and ask a question? Could I get a show of hands? Okay, I've got two here, so you and then you.
One of my colleagues who works in computer vision wrote an article recently calling for an FDA-like approval of machine learning, particularly computer vision algorithm for face recognition, for example, that says, you know, each time a particular package is released and tested, what it does well, what it doesn't do, where it fails, and so on, by an independent body. What do the panelists think about that?
I think that from my point of view is that, of course, I mean, right now we see a lot of, for example, the Warsaw example, for example, that means that, okay, so you can find some, for example, the bugs from there. But on the other hand, we cannot prevent these things from happening. The more reasonable things, I think, from what we can see is that you probably set up some sort of objective measurements, and then there's supposed to be a set of hierarchical ways you try to measure the performance of system. Instead of saying that it's yes or no answer, you probably set up some sort of probabilistic answer to these questions. And then by adjusting different measurements, you probably have different level of rigor in terms of the answer. I think that's something that from engineering part of the side of view is probably workable instead of just saying yes or no.
So I think it's, I mean, in some sense, it sounds like it should be a relatively straightforward thing to do. But I think, especially if you take something like facial recognition, it will be so hard to actually create a representative test that whatever test you come up with, it will still be a lot of failures when the system is running.
Harder than drug?
Sorry?
Harder than for drug?
So I mean, then what I mean, I guess drugs is probably a good example, because there, of course, there's still the liability of the manufacturer to deal with the potential negative consequences of the drug, even if it has been approved. So in some sense, what I do think an approval like that could do is to raise the lower, the lower limit of the problem, but you will not be completely take away all the problems. So I think in some sense you probably need a culture of sharing examples of things where it didn't go well, so that you can improve on this and continually raise the lower bar of these systems. Then I think it would work, but it wouldn't. I don't think it would work in order to take away the liability of the manufacturer of the system.
Yeah. Okay. From my perspective, what would be, we need transdisciplinary research, and what would be then some kind of an integrating thought, what we call all, I think, should address in these kind of discussions. And from my perspective, if we only limit ourselves for the moment to intelligent systems and not super intelligence or human-like knowledge creators. So if we only limit ourselves even to intelligent systems, from my perspective, we go to transdisciplinary approach to that, then I think one of the main things which is missing there is when we talk about safety, when we talk about ethics, when we're talking about optimization, when we're talking about all these kind of things, in many discussions it's more or less implicitly assumed that everybody understands what they're talking about then. And actually that is, the more you go into that, the more you realize that people actually have totally different understanding of what they're actually even talking about. So I think one of the main things we need to do here is, first of all, realize actually that we are talking about sometimes completely different things here, and try to come up with a common understanding or common language, actually how to express these kind of things and how to capture them actually in what we call utility functions. for able to systems to optimize even on these kind of things. And the second thing actually is that if we understand that, then we also need to understand how we actually are going to optimize these type of systems throughout all the capabilities of these systems towards these high-level goals. And I see that it's coming from different perspectives. People fill in these things from different perspectives and the different transdisciplinary knowledge. So I also would like to understand from your perspective how you would like to approach this and how to tackle this and how to come to a common understanding.
So, a question on common understanding. So sometimes we use the same words and the same to mean very different things. We understand the same concepts in different ways. I also know that sometimes we use different words to mean the same things. And does the panel have views on how we actually kind of tackle that as an issue? Nadisha and then Gopal.
Yeah, I think in general it always helps to have a scientific grounding of what we're talking about. So if we say we refer to that, and when we mean that, we mean this phenomenon in science, then it is not ambiguous anymore. So I think that's the way out.
Can you hear me okay? So something that I'd like to see a bit more of in scientific discussions is active attempts to use something along the lines of Rand Corporation's Delphi protocol for iterative expert elicitation. And I wonder if techniques like this can help us arrive at a mutual understanding and shared language more effectively. Because oftentimes we talk past each other and then don't make deliberate efforts to actually understand what another person is saying. And so something I've been trying just informally, even with some colleagues, is to try a kind of round-robin type iterative discussion format where I say, okay, there's three of us. We have a certain belief about, just as an example, the efficacy of a certain venture capital firm's investment portfolio in pharmaceuticals. All three people write up their opinion. We read each other's opinions, and then we iterate and go from there. And I think sometimes introducing some of these formal deliberative processes might help us overcome some of these obstacles, just because it's so easy not to do so. And then we just end up maintaining the status quo of letting the disagreement sit around and never really trying to understand what's underlying them. So that's just an idea I'd like to throw out there.
I could make a comment more on the optimization part, because I think that's quite an interesting question, whether are we really optimizing one thing? So sometimes I think in many of these questions it's really about making a trade-off between many different things that you would like to optimize, but you cannot achieve all of them at the same time. And you have to make a trade-off between different communities or different values and these things. And I mean, usually that discussion, how do we trade off accuracy versus discrimination or these things. I mean, it's really, really hard kind of social discussions to have around those trade-offs. So I think that's also interesting to but I mean, and my point is more, I think it will be very hard to find a single kind of utility function that you want to optimize, but more you need to make a trade-off between multiple of these, and how to do that trade-off is really challenging.
Fascinating is, it seems like a part of the paradigm shift we need is a greater level of engagement between cutting-edge research in machine learning and the state of the engineering side of things. But I'm curious how far this needs to go. So you could argue that things like meta-architecture search and meta-algorithmic search, we're not going to be deploying systems that are doing this in the real world. On the other hand, we might end up integrating the results of these systems into systems we use in the real world. So what do we specifically need more knowledge and insight for when it comes to the kind of present-day engineering side of this from the research side? And likewise, from the engineering side, the people who are developing algorithms at the kind of front-end research side, they need to understand something about what the real-world situations in which these algorithms are going to be used are going to be, or what the practical requirements and regulatory requirements will be, and what this means for fundamental research. But presumably they don't need to know every single detail of process assurance and so on. So my question is, where do we really need to hone in and develop a better shared understanding? And where do we think some things can remain somewhat separate, at least for the time being?
It's a very difficult question, to be honest. So I mean, it's really the things that this is basically what we are doing right now. Is that okay? So we have this, for example, a neural network, and we know that the neural network is in this kind of structure. And then for verification people, it's just taking this kind of structure and not understanding what actually the design behind of it, the intuition behind of it, and we just take these things and do whatever we want. But I would say this kind of thing is, as far as we understand, that does not necessarily work the best. And how far is these things has to be go towards the understanding of the real machine learning is doing. I cannot quantify it, but I would say right now it's quite away from what actually the two areas is doing. So that could take a few years, I guess, to have a mutual understanding.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and yeah, hugely complicated. I think for me, there's the nature of safety research is trying to be, forward-looking, anticipating what's going to happen, and there's an aspect of basic research where you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how what you are producing is actually going to be translated into the real world, and it's even more complicated because there's sociological factors where the incentives that entrepreneurs, for example, have, which is maybe to go to market very quickly and maybe using the latest advances in basic research in certain ways. And so I guess from my point of view, I sometimes feel bewildered by not knowing how what I am doing, will affect the world. And it's, I think, quite confusing. And I can't quite grapple with all these uncertainties. So I wish I had a better answer, but it's something I think is really, really important to think about.
So I think from an engineering point of view, I think it's really important to build a safety culture. And I mean, it has to be part of the way, for example, the company or wherever you work, how you do the work. So I mean, I've had a lot of collaboration with the aeronautics industry, and of course there the safety is very critical and very central. And there you build into the culture that you always take into consideration safety. And I think actually another interesting thing I learned from them is that what they say is that you will never find a single system that will make your system safe. Basically, for every order of magnitude safer you want to make your system, you have to build another layer around your system that can handle other types of issues. And you need to have redundancy and all these things. So I think we have to get away from the notion that, we will have like a single way of making things safe, but more, how do we build systems, shielding the system from different things and building layers on layers to do that. From a more kind of science perspective, I think this is also related to that. I mean, one thing that usually happens is that there's a lot of implicit assumptions. So when I developed my assumption, I made the assumption that, it should be unimodal stationary distribution, and then someone tries to apply it in a different situation where it's non-stationary or multimodal or something like that, and then these fundamental assumptions that were made before or as part of developing it are no longer true. So I think try to be more explicit about the assumptions that we make when we develop different technologies, for example. I think is a good way to improve the integration capabilities and the way easy to transfer algorithms into different domains.
Yeah, I agree that we need this culture of safety. We more generally need a tradition of criticism. And as we know that we cannot predict a future that is going to be highly dependent on the creation of new knowledge, The only thing we know is that knowledge is fallible, and that it means that we are going to make errors. So I think we need, for AI safety reasons, we need an institutional basis that provides us the possibility to have a societal level error correction, because we can be proactive in security related ways. However, this is only related to the current models of the world that we have. So there are new risks that are out there, but we do not realize that they exist. So that is why we also need to be able to recover once something happens that was not foreseen, I think. So that's why we propose a socio-technological feedback loop approach.
Gopal, do you want to say something?
Yes, sure. I hope I heard the initial question correctly. What I think my takeaway was you were asking, where do we need integration, where is it okay to leave things separate? Did I get that correctly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I guess maybe I'll kind of restate a stronger version of the claim in my talk, which is that I don't think we can afford to do so for biomedicine. I think the consequences would be particularly negative. And so that's one answer, but I'll add to that by saying that I think one of the values of really being anchored to a practical engineering discipline is that you have a natural life cycle of concrete deliverables. And I think that really gives us the ability to move from, say, abstract insights in AI and AI safety to practical techniques that are, say, used by scientists and maybe even products that are deployed in the real world. Like directly to patients, to hospitals, wearables. And so I think there's an opportunity really to develop our kind of management and policy skills. I think one of the other panelists was talking about society-level error correction. And so I think that type of thinking is something that's needed in the life sciences, and hopefully where insights in life sciences can then be translated to other realms that will also interact with AI safety.
Yes, this was more of a comment, sort of adding to the point before about the communication of the different assumptions. So I would say that in terms of deployment, there are many different types of models out there as to just how much of the AI knowledge and work is done at what levels. And oftentimes, there would actually be something like AutoML being put in production as maybe a tool for folks who are much less technical to just upload some data and then have a model that comes out, and then they might actually just use that. So, or for that matter, they might even do some API integration such that they're constantly doing that. So it would even be like AutoML or something like that in production. So the point is that really, in a way, we should be trying to get technical product managers to be able to audit the assumptions and the capabilities and the provenance and the safety requirements all throughout the stack, and either make sure that their team is doing the work needed in a given tier to do the type of assurance needed for their particular application area, or that it has already been done sufficiently. I would also separately like to comment that with respect to using the same word in different ways, something that's very useful would simply be to add modifiers before that, and then simply kind of split the term so it can be used more broadly, but in with those modifiers.
Would anyone on the panel like to respond to that? Okay, we have a question from Sean.
It's a bit more a comment than a question, but you implied that the engineers didn't need to know about process assurance. I think that's completely wrong. That you will not be able to assure the end product if you don't know how it was produced. I know some very, very expensive things that have been thrown away because people didn't actually look at the process as they went through and looking at the safety requirements and so on, as Richard is saying. So you really have to have process visibility to have a hope of controlling these sorts of things. Does anybody want to disagree with me?
Hi. So I just want to ask a question which puzzled me for some time when I saw the word AI safety. I think it is proper, before we talk about AI safety, we step one step back to look at the AI itself. I mean, we have to admit the AI research itself has made amazing progress. Look at the BERT, look at the transformer, everything. But still, the vast majority of the algorithm that we are working on is currently could be categorized as a PAC problems. PAC algorithm, which means probably, approximately correct. So, which means those models, all models are born wrong. So we cannot guarantee that there's also a probabilistic, the model will go wrong. So we basically want to build the AI safety based on those models which are probably defect already when we transact, right? So do you think that we need to rethinking the fundamental of the AI algorithm itself before we go on to the AI safety? I don't know if I make myself clear.
So I mean, yes, that is. I mean, so actually, I think I mean, when you develop these systems, you have to be aware that they will always be incorrect in some aspect. So actually, I talk to people who develop really large software system over very long periods of time, and usually you never get rid of all the bugs. There will always be bugs in your system. But what they said was that you push the bugs out to the boundaries of the software, and kind of the core of the system is getting more and more correct. But of course, in the overall system will still be issues. Yeah. I think that's one kind of way of thinking about it, that you want to have some central parts that you make as correct and as capturing the reality as well as possible that you want. And then I think the second aspect is, as was mentioned here, that you really have to have a way of when it goes wrong, what do you do then? How do you kind of continually improve your system over time? And I also think you probably need to kind of cultivate this, that you have to admit when systems do something wrong and try to fix it rather than try to cover it up or try to ignore it in other ways. So that over time, we reduce the uncertainty and increase the correctness, at least for those parts which are really used and in those situations where it's really used, and try to figure out when does it work and when doesn't it work, and then improve over time. Some thoughts.
Yes. I can say something. So I think that we cannot actually eliminate all the risks, all the failures. But on the other hand, so we do expect that when there's a failure, we are able to know what's going on there. So we do really need to have tools, whatever the methods, that when there's something break, and you are able to understand what has been done, what has been done wrong, and then you probably wanted to fix next time. I think that's critical.
Okay, we have the last question, then I have one closing question, and then there'll be time for lunch. Your question, sir.
So my question is almost the exact opposite. I'd like to know if it might be better to treat any system as completely black box, because when I look at let's say safety for missiles or for airplanes or for trains, what you do is you say you never dive into the physics. You never think that if you understand what happens at the molecular level that you'll understand what happens at the level of the whole missile. What you do is you experiment. You test 1,000 missiles. You see what happens. You gather the statistics, and then you work with that. And what you really want to end up being able to do is say, in the chance of 1 in a million, this and this will happen once a year, and you really want those numbers, and then you want to be able to have the product manager, let's say, product manager or whoever's in charge of safety, define, okay, this has to be an even safer product. Instead of 1 in a million, this is 1 in 10 million chance of this and this happening. So I'm really wondering if we really think we can dive into the neurons and the each layer to even think towards those types of understanding or defining mechanisms, rather than looking at a macroscopic level and using what we know about and with a black box approach about some of the models that have been tested.
So, I mean, I would argue that that's not, I mean, to me, that's complementary to what has already been said. I mean, I already mentioned this, the way that the aeronautics industry works, because, I mean, that's basically what they do. They have this kind of layers of system. But of course, for each level or in each layer in your system, you have to understand that part to improve that as much as you can. But then you will reach some kind of limit, and then you have to add something else to on top of that. So I don't see it as contradictory. In some sense, you need both. So I think that's, I mean, I do think that's a good approach. Of course, there's always a challenge of trying to estimate these probabilities. And I think here we can get also interesting issues regarding scale, especially if you have systems with billions of users. So even if you have one error per billion and you have a billion users every day, you will still have an error every day, which may or may not be a good, I mean, it might be okay, but and I think this is another aspect when you have this highly automated system, that the scale gets so large, so even very, very low error probabilities still generate too many errors or false alarms and so on to deal with.
Okay. You want to say something? Okay, well, we're coming close to the end of time, so I'd like to pose one final question for the panel, but also maybe for the audience to be thinking about over the lunch break. And that's, practically speaking, we'd be talking about the need for a paradigm shift in AI safety. Practically speaking, what does that look like? And the way I'd like to pose this is, if we were to hold this workshop in 5 years' time, how would it be different if we had a successful paradigm shift in AI safety research? Who would be in the room who's not here today? What would we have that we don't have now in terms of frameworks, in terms of ideas? Would there be questions on our radar that aren't there already? Do we have any thoughts on what this looks like successfully if we do achieve this kind of paradigm shift over the next couple of years?
Question after lunch. Answer after lunch.
Well, you can also answer after lunch, but if anyone has any initial thoughts, is there anyone who should be in the room in terms of expertise who we don't have, who, if we do a successful job in integrating between disciplines, in better bringing knowledge from one domain into another domain to really kind of update our view of what AI safety is there anything that we're doing differently if we try to do this again in 5 years' time?
I think one possibility is, for instance, to integrate actually people working on artificial general intelligence. Because I was thinking in the last time that maybe it might be that we have something I would like to call the AI safety paradox, which is that actually value alignment and control seem to represent a type of a metaphor for conjugate variables. So if that is true, then actually if you have AGI people that are building AGIs, it would be important to support them with a type of error correction from the AI safety perspective. So yeah, just trying to prohibit it is not going to solve the problem there.
So I mean, I think in some sense we want to kind of take the next step in our understanding that what do we really mean by this concept, and I mean, hopefully we'll have a much better understanding and we kind of get beyond kind of, oh, what do we mean this time, and then actually getting beyond that and start being more specific and more concrete. And I mean, I also think it should be more a natural part. I mean, I think in some sense that is a trend, at least that I see, is that more and more people realize that this is important. We have to do more about it. So, I mean, I think in one sense we probably, hopefully, would need a bigger room because I think more people would be interested. I mean, you could potentially could also be kind of the opposite. That if it becomes so natural that everyone deals with it, there might not be the need for a specific venue for it because it will be a natural part of every venue. Then you will really have a paradigm shift if that has happened.
I think it's a really, really good question, and I don't think that I have a profound answer, but I think, yeah, it's a great thing for us to reflect on. One thing I would say is, like, building on what you said, there's some analogy, I can't remember who within the safety community said it, but like, there's no like bridge, there's not someone, when you're building a bridge, you don't necessarily think about bridge safety. It's just sort of like built into the nature of the process. That's something so deeply integrated that you don't actually think of that as a separate sort of paradigm. It's just part of the undertaking. And so maybe eventually that's something to aspire towards.
That was Stuart Russell in Energie.
Yeah.
Xiaowei, Gopal?
To be honest, I'm not very optimistic that we are going to get a bigger room because that in terms of what we saw in history, for example, the software verification is that okay, so after many years of software verification, you're still not able to say that okay, so we got a lot of people actually very interested in this topic. So similar for this kind of engineering things for the AI. I think most of people will still be on the pathway of developing things, but a small group of people will still working on this kind of thing, trying to quantify the quality of the deep learning. But as I said, so I would expect still similar things. But the only thing I can think about is that probably we got more industrial people actually interested in this kind of scheme because they are really the users of the system, and they definitely want to be interested in what's the safety of the final product.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I've sort of spoken to this topic. Hold on, I think I'm getting some feedback. Let me. So my recommendation, thus far has been, we need to have the life sciences at the table. So I'll maybe speak in a bit more detail about that. I would specifically say, so of course you need the machine learners in the life sciences there, but I think it's important that we also have experimentalists who collaborate with the machine learners, as well as people from the policy side of things, such as biosecurity and biosafety. Just to give an anchor point that I only briefly touched on, there is a very active international conversation happening right now about the ethics of germline gene editing in humans. And there's a safety component that's related to the ethical question, which is, for example, when we make edits to a genome, are there off-target effects, right? That's like a genomic safety question. And so I think there's two ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, I want to see all of those people engaged in the AI safety community, but conversely, we can also go and have a greater presence at those conferences and workshops and conversations, because they've been going on since 1975 when the first Asilomar conference was held on recombinant DNA. So I think from the perspective of the life sciences, there's multiple avenues where we can really build these connections, and I think that is part of paradigm change.
For an absolutely fascinating discussion. To remind you, we'll be back here after the lunch break at 2 o'clock for a session on towards more human-centric and ethics-aware autonomous systems, kicked off by an invited talk by Virginia Dignam on AI safety for humans. Before we go, I'd like you to give a round of applause to our wonderful speakers and panel, Xiaowei, Gopal, Nadisha, Fredrik, and Joel. And to the room overall. We may not have the biggest room, but I think we can all agree we have possibly the most interesting and smartest room based on the fascinating comments and questions that we've had. I've certainly found it an amazing session. So thank you everyone, and a big round of applause.